Hi folks, this is Samuel Silbury at Nirmata. Today I'm going to talk to you about how to use Nirmata as a DevOps user. If you've watched some of my other videos, you'll notice most of what I've been talking about is more from an admin perspective. Some of it works for both admin and DevOps users, but generally I'm in an admin account demonstrating things. So we can see here the dashboard of an admin user, and then we can also see our left-hand side here all these various tabs we can get to. We could look at various clusters, see their states. We can see recent activity. If we want to close things and get more access over here, we can. And this goes to just icons. But if you're a DevOps user, you're probably going to see a very different view. You're probably going to see this view when you come to your dashboard, because you probably don't have direct access to any clusters. You might have access to namespaces / environments within those clusters, but you don't actually have the ability to see the cluster as a whole. So you can see over here, we have a much more limited set of tabs. We've got our dashboard, our alarms. I don't really have the ability to configure anything useful because I don't have an ability to see any environments or clusters at this point. If we go over here to catalog, we don't have access to any of the catalogs, although I could add my own personal catalog. Let's just call it Sam DevOps, and maybe we should spell it right. All right. So we add that there. So I now have my own personal catalog. I can add applications to it. I can even give people access to my catalogs, so on and so forth, because I'm an owner of this catalog. If somebody else owned it, I might not be able to access my access controls and add people to it. I also have access to any of the Helm repos that are configured. I can't add a new Helm repo. If I were over here as an administrator, I do have the ability to add a Helm repo. So if you do need additional Helm repos installed, you're going to need to get your admin to do that. Environments, I don't have access to any environments, and clusters, I don't have access to any clusters. I can add an image registry and I can browse the existing ones. And if we go over here to settings, this is a very important page here, your profile page. If you look here at my access, I have that catalog I created, and I have admin permission there. I don't have any permission on any clusters. I don't have any permission on any environments. Environments are basically namespaces with a few extra Nirmata configuration added. So if we go up to the top here, I can copy an API key. I can generate an API key. Change password may not exist. If you're a SAML user, for example, you won't have an option to change your password. And then view kubeconf file. So right now, this kubeconf file is not going to do me any good because I don't have any access to clusters or environments. But if I were given access to an environment or a cluster, I would be able to download this kubeconf file and run kubectl. Now, if you have access to just an environment and not the cluster, you won't be able to see all the namespaces in the cluster. You won't even be able to see the nodes in the cluster. You'll just be able to access your individual namespaces that you've been allowed. So we're going to go back here as my admin user, go over to identity and access, and let's see, okay, we're already looking for Sam. So we've got Sam Dev here. So if we grab Sam Dev here, and as an administrator, I add the dev team here. All right, so now I'm looking at this user. I can see we've got access to a whole bunch of catalogs. We've got namespace creator permission on this particular cluster, and the environment Sam test with admin privileges is accessible. So if we go back here, and let's just go over to integrations and come back, you can see now I can see everything that you just saw in the admin account. You can see I'm a member of the dev team. You can see my role as DevOps. You can see I'm using a local identity provider. Here's my email and my username. So if we go over to environments now, we can see SAM test. If we go over to catalog, we can see a whole bunch of catalogs. There's still not much in the dashboard. If we go over to cluster, we can look but not touch. We could create an environment on this cluster. If we wanted to call it SAM test 2, we can give it whatever namespace we want. We can assign a environment type, and then that will show up over here. So you can see we also have the ability to add environments now, but only on the vCloud cluster. There are other clusters attached to this Nirmata environment, but we don't have any access to these clusters. If I were to take away my access to vCloud, now we go over here, we don't have access to any clusters. We also don't have any way of creating any environments. Also, it removed my access to that other cluster, that other environment, because my only reason I was getting access to that environment was through the cluster settings. So let's go to SAM test 2. We can see in our settings, this is owned by myself, which means that I can manipulate the access controls, I can manipulate the quotas, and so on and so forth. This is not going to be how you're typically going to interact with an environment as a DevOps user, most likely. Let's actually find, oops. Let's find SAM test here. So we're going to go to settings and go over to settings, and we're going to add in the dev team with edit access. Oops. And so if we go back to environments, SAM test. So if we go over here to settings, now you're going to notice we can't edit resource quotas or limit ranges. We can't add people or remove people. If we had admin permission instead of edit permission, or if we were the owner, we would be able to do these things. But in general, as a DevOps user, you're not going to be able to change much things in the settings of your environment. Note that I can add labels and I can change my update policy. So update policies are important. By default, new environments are set to notify. So if you have an application that you've installed via the catalog, that application will be linked to the application in your environment. If you make a change in the catalog and your policy is notify, you will get a change request to apply those changes. If you're set to update and you change the catalog, you will immediately get any changes that come down the pipe. So that's one thing to keep in mind when you're here. You can also view activity, analytics, other resources, and then any applications you have. So let's go to the catalog here. Let's go over to SAM DevOps and let's add an application. Let's just do something really simple. Let's just grab this Nginx. All right. So now we've got a simple deployment. We don't have any services. We don't have any config and storage. We do have 3 replicas here. So in here, you can manipulate your application. You can go in and directly edit, deployments or config maps or things like that. We could change, for instance, how many replicas we have. Move it down to 1, and so on and so forth. We can also set limits. And of course, we can configure services. We can set up persistent volume claims, config maps, secrets. In general, note that roles and role bindings and service accounts, as a DevOps user, you're not going to be able to create these kinds of resources. You could configure them here, but you probably aren't going to have permission to apply any of this class of controls. Likewise, with the cluster resources, you're probably not going to be able to apply any of these. But you can do things like, horizontal pod autoscaler and things like that. So let's run this application. We'll call it Nginx. And then we can see here we've got 2 environments available. Let's just run it in SAM test. And so now we have it. It's starting to deploy. It's got to pull its image. Now, the things to note on this page here, you can see this application right here. This name here is a link back to my catalog app. From my catalog app, you're going to have a link here that you can click on View Running Applications, and you can click on this. So I could run an Nginx in multiple environments and on multiple clusters if I had access to multiple clusters. So when we expand this here, we're going to see our pods. So here, this is our deployment resource. You can see it's kind deployment. You can see it's 1 of 1 pods. If we click on this, this is going to get us to our pod screen. And we can see what the IP address of the pod is, what node it's running on, how long it's been running. As long as you're running the right number of pods, this is going to be green. This is going to give us access to the logs for it. If you click on the X, that's going to delete the pods. Since this is a deployment, the deployment's going to bring back up a pod. You'll notice this has now failed. That was blue when it was pulling. And now we're up and running again. If we click into the pod, we can see our containers. So you could have multiple containers in your pod. Note that you have the log button again. You also have this other icon, and this is the launch terminal icon. If we click on that, we're going to launch a terminal. And while we're waiting for that, we're also going to launch our logs. Looks like our cluster's a little bit slow today. There we go. So this is just, a Linux command prompt. Note that your container does not necessarily have a shell in it. If it doesn't have a shell, you're not going to be able to do what I'm doing here. But this is a good way to do debugging. The other thing you can do is sometimes you can make a custom deployment just to be able to run a shell and run certain networking commands within the same namespace that you're running in. We're going to close this out here. We'll click on Start Logging here. Looks like Nginx is not chatty today. This particular container is not actually putting anything to its logs, so there's nothing here. So that's pretty much it. Note that when we're looking at navigation here, always look up here. This is going to be your navigation bar. What this button here is going to go back to your application, but this is the application in the environment. This is going to go back to SAM test, and this is just going to go back to the environments tab. You'll notice at the top here, we have recently visited applications. We can click on that. Here, it tells us what our application is, what namespace we're running in, what catalog this application is in. And you'll notice we can jump back to the catalog app here. So what happens if we edit our catalog app? So we edit our catalog app. Let's just do something simple like replicas. We could also do something like, change what version of Nginx we're running. So let's jump back to our launched app. You'll notice we have this blue bar here that says change request. We can click on it to view details. If we click on the diff here, we're going to see that we've changed replicas from 1 to 2. We'll just accept all changes. Yes. And so now we go to sort of a light green because we don't have the required number of pods. Now we've done it, we're back up to the required number of pods. The change request goes away. Note that you don't really need to do that to edit your replicas. You can just go in here and change your replicas. And this will then kill off one of our pods. So that's how you do applications. Taking one from a catalog to an environment. Note that with our environment, if we go back to SAM test, we click on our update action to be update instead of notify. Then let's go back to our original Nginx application here. Let's change this to 3 replicas. Review launched application. You can see it's in a degraded state. You can see now we're running 3. Note that we have these 2 buttons here, alarms and system tasks. So if we do something like that, this is going to try to bring up that. You notice how this has failed. If we go into the pod, we will find here that we tried to pull the container. It didn't work. It's now stuck in waiting. There'll be nothing in the logs. You won't be able to access the console. You're just sort of stuck here. If we go back here, we're going to see a red bar, view details. The reason we failed here is image pulled back off. And this pod is just going to be forever stuck in waiting because that image is never going to exist. You can also see your system tasks. Here we can see where we updated a resource. We can see here we changed that. In this other case, we can see, okay, we went from 1 replica to 3 replicas. And that's pretty much managing your applications.